This video is about the graphic model Sigmund Freud developed to answer the question of how neural networks strive to maintain a stable, low-energy state. A stimulus from either inside or outside must be balanced by an opposite force that returns the system to a near-zero state. Freud notes how dreams are the same as waking experience in this respect. But because dreams are self-generated, so to speak, and because dreams are isolated not just by the function of fulfilling a wish, but by the buffer that protects the sleeper, the dream is a kind of laboratory situation that allows us to study its logic in a simplified situation. We can then transfer our findings to the psychical apparatus in its more complex functioning in the waking world. I use the word idempotency to talk about homeostasis, to say how it is not just about balancing out stimulus with a counter or anti-stimulus, but also this balancing act develops the ability to defend against further attacks by stocking the unconscious with ammunition to fend off further attacks. Perhaps this is what Freud meant with the term Vorstellungsrepräsentanz, the empty signifier. The signifier that is sheer signifierness, which he says is a part of the MEMS he shows in this graph. An idempotency switch you will know from everyday life is the elevator button, which you need to press only once. Pressing it over and over again doesn't change anything. The dream and the unconscious are like this. The dream wants to keep the sleeper sleeping, while the unconscious wants to defend its borders against invasions by the consciousness. Another name for the unconscious is border defense, which means that idempotency is about continence. The border may be all there is to it, actually. It's when symptoms show up that we have the uncanny feeling that the consciousness has not defended its borders in the same way, and that in terms of the unconsciousness, it is easily penetrated by the disinformation campaign we call symptoms. When various psychologists reproduce Freud's diagram, they seem compelled to add, subtract, or revise. So we have to look at the main functions and structures. The dream, Freud wants to say, is a series of things he calls MEMS, a combination of some image we encounter and a memory we recall, a way of testing and valuing the present by comparing it with the past. Think of it like the old days of car travel, when you would have to look at the streets, then the map, then back again to the streets in front of you to figure out where you really were. Each step combined what you had stored in the map with what you saw looking out of the window, and the combination revised your idea of where you were on the journey. And these MEMS were the way you were able to keep your journey moving, just as in the dream, their purpose is to keep the dream moving and insulate the sleeper from disturbances. If the aim of the dream is to keep the sleeper asleep, the dream has to have access to another form of protection. It must allow the unconscious to short-circuit the series of dream parts, to make the short circuit and run to the end of the series without regard to any time sense. It can put the stimulus at the end of the dream, although it is technically the thing that comes first. This time-reversing capability is what makes the pleasure principle look the same as what goes beyond the pleasure principle. This is because the jouissance, that is, the juice of homeostasis, or idempotency, is like a pharmacon. It can be either a positive or negative energy. Personally, it doesn't care. This is why what Freud called a death drive was both something destructive and something desirable, a nirvana principle. This is not against the pleasure principle because pleasure was always ambiguous, about the way enjoying and being enjoyed were fundamentally indistinguishable. Parts of the signifying chain inside the dream can be pulled into the unconscious directly. Freud ventures the hypothesis that there are actually two psychical agencies, and that one of them subjects the other to criticism, a kind of internal system of censors redacting a report. Although we don't know where these censors hide out or how they operate, the excluded text proves that they exist and are active within the dream. The dream itself forgets part of itself and constructs a zone within the short-circuiting, time-traveling unconscious. We could think of this zone as being like the dressing rooms of a theater, where the actors have costumes for many different plays and can come onto the stage dressed to play another part in another play. The whole repertoire of the theater can be mixed together and reordered thanks to these dressing rooms, but we don't have the keys to them. It's only when the actors come out with unexpected costumes that we deduce their nature. This excluded text proves the existence of some kind of agency within the dream that operates as a concealing other who holds the keys to desire. As confusing as this may sound as a proposition, it is something we can see and understand in actual situations, where two actors play one role or one actor plays two roles, as in David Lynch's Mulholland Drive. The uncanny effect requires the model of the backstage dressing room where all the costumes are hung in the same closet, and a stage where two actors can appear together but seem to be acting in different plays. When Abraham Moles tried to quantify aesthetic experience, people were offended, but really he wanted to do a little experiment that was about finding things. If we want to locate a dot inside a square, but are limited to asking yes-no questions, we would always ask the same question and always about the same thing. We would draw a line dividing the square into two equal halves and ask, is it on the right? Or left? It doesn't matter. If the answer is yes, we only have a vague idea of where the dot is, but we know we're at least on the right side. So we divide the space again and ask the same question again. We keep dividing and asking. Each time we do this, we pay a price in energy input, but we get a more refined answer. If there is a threshold, such as the accuracy requirements the military has for GPS devices, we can stop when we reach it. But technically, we could go further. The golden rectangle that has the ratio of the Fibonacci number series is the same kind of device. We can go into infinite detail about the location of its dot, ever more precisely at the ratio of phi, because the principle of growth or shrinkage is a constant. And this is another important aspect of idempotency. In fact, it is one that applies to almost everything in nature that grows from small to large in any orderly way. Because the Fibonacci ratio doesn't care whether we are going small or large, it is both inside and outside the system of relations. Lacan's word for this feature is extimité, meaning that the intimacy we normally associate with an interior can be flipped to the most outer limit, because the relationship is the same. In psychoanalysis, extimity is about the uncanny familiarity of objective, strange things, and the equally uncanny alien quality of our innermost nature. As Freud said, we are strangers in our own houses. Lacan realized that Freud's idempotency model could be mathematized even more precisely with the idea of the one, or what he called the unary trait. This comes from the idea that the one is able to signify itself, to say that it is a one of one, so to speak, and how every number can be written as itself over one, an instance as well as something that is a part of the counting number system. If the meaning of a signifier, the big S, is really itself, we have an idempotency situation. The unary trait is both a figure on the ground of itself and the ground with itself as a figure, something like an Escher drawing of people going up and down the same staircase. If we take the Fibonacci number series and write it in this way, we can draw a line between the big S and small s versions, jog them across each other by one step, and get the fractions that become successively better approximations of the value of phi. This shows how the mems can repeat themselves but never really change the sum, which is always going to be phi. This way of writing out the unary trait also shows how any segment of the series can be drawn into the unconscious as a trait that is a signifier of itself, a Vorstellungsrepräsentanz. This explains how parts, and sometimes the whole of a dream, seem able to step outside of linear time and jump to the end of the story, so to speak. Just as the pleasure principle was already the death drive going beyond the pleasure principle, the cut is there all along. This can be demonstrated in the self-intersecting expression of the Fibonacci ratio as x equals 1 plus 1 over x. Each time we take a measure of the short-circuiting process, we get one of the numbers of the series, meaning that the ratio that never changes works like a ghost in the machine, because the machine and the ghost, or mind, were the same thing all along. Lacan has used this idea in many places throughout his writings, sometimes beginning with Descartes' cogito principle, I think, therefore I am. Typically, we ponder this as some kind of wisdom, because we suppress what we have to already know when we read it, namely, that it is something said by someone who already exists. It is not scientific in a Popperian way, meaning that we cannot refute it by turning it around. Anyone who tells you he doesn't exist is both existing and thinking in order to say that. So you have a Cartesian version of the lying Cretan who says all Cretans are liars. Lacan puts these propositions in the form of the algebra used to calculate the Fibonacci series to demonstrate how idempotency produces an unconscious out of sheer self-intersection. This system also involves non-orientation because each position negates the previous step by using the numerator in the position of the denominator in a crisscross way. In German, the word for crisscross, verschränken, also means closet. To twist something is also to hide it away, to make it into a latent signifier. The unconscious is composed entirely of latent signifiers. Since every conscious experience, image, or idea has an unconscious or repressed component, there is always a balance, always a stability between the latent and the manifest. I should add this short final note. In psychoanalysis, we talk about what we want as a binary process. On the side of the speaking subject, desire is actually a demand that is repeated. Repetition is nothing more than a manifestation of a demand or expectation made to the other. But what is this other? It is a line that comes from outside the spiraling system of returns the subject makes, going back to the place where he or she has experienced pleasure, but now that pleasure is nowhere to be found. The subject must circle around again, and the repetition of these circles will create a spiral. But the line that pulls these demands along the spiral is itself a circle that loops around to complete itself, but this completion is also a gap or void. Lacan says that the relation of demand of the subject and the desire of the other constructs a torus, a figure that is both continent and incontinent, but whose surface can be used to construct self-intersecting figures such as the interior eight. The point where desire returns to its origin is antipodal to the same point as a point of departure, as the standard polygon of the torus shows with its divergent and convergent vectors. The gap is the same as a cut, and we can demonstrate this by cutting into the solid part of the torus if we twist the knife 360 degrees as we cut. The torus splits into two parts along a surface that is itself a pure cut. When pulled apart, we see that there are two Mobius bands. If you think this is abstract and unrelated to everyday life, just remember that Putin's invasion of the Ukraine created an externality by going inside it, finding out that what they thought was a simple line was in fact a torus with an unconscious desire.